Today's episode of Path to Power is brought to you by Greenman, an Irish investment management firm with over 20 years of experience.
Greenman Open is a European long-term investment fund, or LTIF. It's focused on grocery-anchored retail real estate. These are the kinds of properties that some investors believe remain essential even in uncertain markets. People still need to buy food. That's what they say makes this sector more resilient and more stable over the long term.
Unlike many alternative investment funds that are only available to professionals, Greenman Open is open to a wide range of investors with lower minimum investments and a highly regulated structure.
Just remember, all investments carry risk. Values can go up or down, and past performance isn't a reliable guide to future returns. Greenman Open is a regulated LTIF, but you should always speak to a financial advisor before investing. Learn more on the website greenmanopen.com.
Hello and welcome to this, our latest edition of Path to Power. I'm Matt Cooper.
And I'm Ivan Yates.
I don't know how many other podcasts you listen to, Ivan, but an awful lot of them seem to work on the basis that the hosts have a sort of a chat before they get into the various topics that they're going to discuss about what they've been doing this week. And this is one of the rare occasions where I think we might actually do a little bit of that, because I know you've been at a very interesting event earlier this week, and I've been at a couple of them as well. And it's great to get out into an opportunity where you're interviewing really interesting people outside of the radio studio or the television studio, and where you're also getting an opportunity to interact with various people. I was yesterday, we're recording Thursday morning, which is a bit unusual, a day earlier than usual for us, but I was at The Real Deal in Goffs on Wednesday, which is a big event for small and medium growing enterprises, organised by a company I think you know well, Renatus Investment Company, run by Mark Flood, and also by Fitzgerald Power, an accountancy firm from the Waterford region run by Stuart Fitzgerald. 1,100 people in the auditorium in Goffs. Terrific day's event and the rest of it. And I also got the opportunity on Tuesday night, and I'm limited in what I can say because this is one of these so-called private Chatham House dinners, but I interviewed the most impressive woman I think I've come across in business ever. And I would go that far. In fact, I'd say possibly the most impressive person I've met in business ever. I did a 45-minute interview with the Chief Financial Officer of OpenAI. And I know you're very interested.
Who owns OpenAI?
Well, OpenAI, that's a sort of a good point, because is it for profit? Is it not for profit? It's very tied into Microsoft. Elon Musk was very involved in its creation, but seems to be a little bit at loggerheads with Sam Altman these days. But this is one of the defining companies of the 21st century. And the Chief Financial Officer, who was hired 8 months ago to work for OpenAI, is an Irish woman.
And based where does she work?
Oh, in California.
Okay,
This is a Silicon Valley company.
Yeah.
And she's been over there for years. She was the right-hand woman to Jack Dorsey in Square, and she's been in other places. She's also a director of Walmart, which is the biggest retailer in the world. Her name is Sarah Fryer. She's from Sign Mills in Tyrone. She is an exceptionally gifted communicator. Interviewing her was an absolute dream, but also just this fierce intelligence that you could get, and an ability to, as I jokingly said at the end of the interview, as well as being in a position where she could go and get her own information out of ChatGPT or whatever, the OpenAI products. She had all the information at her fingertips that she needed to pull down. She had an ability to assess and interpret it, to communicate it, but also a really considered view, not just on the finance that she's responsible for, which is the fundraising that's going on in OpenAI, and then the enormous expenditure on particularly on things like data centers, which I think we'll get to in the bulk of this. But it was just one of these phenomenal opportunities to hear somebody absolutely.
And if you were to summarize
peak.
the best point she made, what would it be? And because I always tell people in communication, I'm only going to give you one sentence to say this, so pick your sentence.
I think, I'm going to pick it, is that artificial intelligence has advanced to a far greater degree than I think many, many people actually understand or appreciate. And we dealt with the whole ethics of that as well, and whether people should be fearing. I mean, she embraces it. She's an enthusiast. She thinks it'll free up. I mean, she gave, and I will say I'm sort of breaking the rules here a little bit by saying one of the things that she said, but I think it's relatively innocuous from a corporate point of view. But, she gave the example, when spreadsheets came in, Excel spreadsheets, that did away with an awful lot of these sort of, people in accounts who were doing
ledgers
and stuff.
Yeah.
And they were paid, then they were able to go and do other things. It didn't mean that they were out of work, but it meant better work for them. But I mean, I would have my fears that artificial intelligence is moving at such a pace and is creating change at such a pace that already people are struggling a little bit to deal with the pace of change in their lives that have been wrought by mobile phones and by the internet and the rest of it. And that is a large part, I think, of a lot of the problems that we face in society at present, the inability of many people to deal with the pace of change. But artificial intelligence is going to accelerate the pace of change quite dramatically and how people cope with that. So anyway, just on the point, I just wanted to bring that up, that she was just one of the most impressive people.
But her central point was?
Oh, well, she had so many points. No, and I wasn't taking notes, Ivan. I was doing the interview, I wasn't in the audience writing down all these
things. I
usually
do a pre-interview thing where I write the notes from what they said so I know the answer to every question I ask.
I don't.
Yeah, I do that.
No. And then,
I would never trust it to fortune. I want to know that your line on this is good.
You see, but then I also listen to the answers rather than actually having all pre-prepared questions. I don't have a list of questions when I do an interview beforehand. I don't agree interviews with people beforehand. You have a different way of doing things. But the reason I bring that up is I know you also were very busy this week, and I know artificial intelligence caught your attention as well.
So just 3 days, Killarney, only there for 2 days. I hosted the whole thing last year, never again. Jonathan McCrae actually hosted it and I moderated a session. But I was there actually to listen more than anything else. It's called the Global Economic Summit. It's organised by the Business Post. It's actually a separate standalone company. So first thing I learned, Micheál the Taoiseach spoke. And what I learned, the usual platitudes and all the rest of it, he actually came up to me afterwards and he said, is his son, what's his son? These two sons.
So one of them is the Cork goalkeeper, Micheál A.
Well, he said, Micheál A, or someone says to me, he was given out to me every weekend. He said, you listening to Ivan Yates? And he said, he's given out about this, that and the other with Matt. And then he told his son in reply, because he's not listening, right? He said, which is actually where the country's at. He's not listening. But the point is, he said, Micheál, the election is over. So he was only interested in the thing when the election was on. But the thing I picked up from him is, the presidency, the last part of 2026. That is going to fall to the critical timing of the next EU budget. And he actually made a strong argument. So McGrath was there, the commissioner, and said about the European economy, there are 26 million companies, all the stuff about its 18 trillion euros of GDP for the 27 member states, and all of the stuff about Trump, although very interesting to note, of the top 50 tech companies in the world, only 4 are European. We have lagged so far. Yes. We've missed the whole search wave, be that Google. We've missed the whole social media wave. But for Macron, we probably would miss the AI wave.
There's a couple of things in that. One, I think part of our problem maybe for Europe, talking about European Union, is the diversity of languages. I mean, the English is the default language, I think, for an awful lot of this tech wave, and that's where we've missed out. But the second major issue is capital fundraising. And money isn't available in Europe. And this is one thing I will say was actually really interesting at the Renatas conference. And this is a political issue as much as it is a business issue. But a number of the contributors across various interviews, and particularly in software, which is such a major part of the tech world, cannot get financing in Ireland. Banks are just reluctant to lend to companies which have an income stream in the future rather than a proven income stream in the past, even though that
they have no EBIT, they have no traditional revenue, it's all futuristic.
Yeah, but there are still certain assets and there are customer lists and there are various assets that even if the business was to fail, that could be sold, that then would actually be able to repay the banks. And the experience of a lot of Irish companies has been in tech, as they've developed, has been that they've had to go to alternative lenders, or they've had to go to the United States or the United Kingdom even to get the money that is not available from Irish banks. Right, the debt finance, and that's a major problem. And also, if again, you and I probably do a lot going to.
And you do stuff with Joe Gill, don't you?
I do. We'll get to that now. 1 second,
yeah.
But there is very interesting in relation to tech that when it's looking for Irish companies, some of them maybe sell out a little bit too early because they don't have the alternative sources of finance. So they find a trade buyer, usually American, and they sell out to those, possibly a little bit earlier than they actually should do. Not in all cases. And one of the companies that was AMCS from Limerick was one of the companies, was at The Real Deal, Jimmy Martin, its boss. And that is a company which has a valuation of over 2 billion, which is, for sake of reference, that's about twice the size of Permanent TSB, would also be much bigger than a stock market company like Greencore or whatever. But Irish companies have been struggling, and the state as well perhaps doesn't really... The state is very good with ISIF and Enterprise Ireland for very early stage development, but then perhaps doesn't really know what to do when the companies get to the stage when they're becoming multinationals, and perhaps need to be treated with the same love and affection that the American multinationals who come to locate in Ireland do. The idea is great at attracting them in, but if you're an Irish company that's expanding from Ireland, do you get the support when you're above a certain size?
2 points. One, the central point that Micheál made that had rocked me in my seat, and no one picked up on it. He said that the EU budget is only 1% of European GDP, and broadly it needs to be doubled. We are contributing 4.5 billion last year as net contributors to the EU. This is a serious annual sum if the budget is doubled. And you know, as I spoke last week, one of the things in their crosshairs is a share of corporation tax. They get the VAT, a big share of that. They need another tax. And I'm saying to myself, watch out here. Ireland could be uniquely punished under the current fiscal arrangement. But the other point I just remember what you've just said is that Joe Gill is the best advocate I've heard. Joe Gill, you can describe who he is, but basically he said Flutter, which is Paddy Power, CRH, Kingspan, and the likes of Kerry would not have become global players without the capitalisation from the Irish Stock Exchange. Under Euronext, that's nearly defunct. You know what I mean? It is not a source of raising capital, and companies scaling up here to become Irish multinationals just can't do it. And that is a huge problem. And Joe has identified this as the serious blocker to the next generation of Irish multinationals, that there is no capital structure.
He's entirely correct. Joe Gill is involved with Goodbody Stockbrokers. He's a sort of a veteran, I suppose, of finance here in Ireland as an advisor. His expertise particularly is in aviation. So he produced a major report last week alongside Eamon Brennan, who is
maybe
former head
talk
of the
about
Aviation
in the
Authority.
Second episode, because there's a lot of... It's 300 billion of a sector.
It's an enormous sector. Again, and I'm not sure the political classes understand the importance necessarily of aviation to
One
the
of
Irish
my
economy.
guests, just to explain, half of the world's planes are leased. And 70% of leased planes, the financing is done through Ireland.
Yeah.
Now, you took up the whole back page of the Business Post with it, but there's actually 5 solid recommendations to sustain Ireland's position. We'll talk about that.
Well, I'm glad I gave you some good reading in the Business Post last Sunday.
Well, actually, I have the report, which I had to go read.
Well, I summarised the report for you.
You did a little bit of that.
Having read it all. But Joe's other expertise is in food companies.
Yeah.
So, and Joe and myself Joe organised and I hosted a conference in UCC for the food and beverage sector the previous week. Again, we had some of the real heavy hitters with really interesting things to say about where Ireland is going to go. And funny enough, actually, just as an aside in relation to that, and I suppose there may be some listeners who are listening to us for the political gossip, which we haven't got to yet because we're into the sort of maybe the big weightier themes. But I do know, because I will be interviewing him on The Last Word next week, the Minister for Agriculture, Martin Hayden, is heading off in a couple of weeks' time to Japan and South Korea. So these are sort of trade missions now outside of the normal Paddy's Day thing.
Yeah.
And it's a major push to try and get Irish food and drink into those markets, that there has been a realisation, I think, in government that whatever deals are done with Donald Trump and the American administration, and, you know, we might get back to something like the status quo eventually, and I know it's something that you want to discuss, that we can't leave ourselves so exposed. We have to find new markets, and we have to develop a much bigger trade with these countries, and there's going to be a big push, I think, over the summer months by Irish ministers to go and find new markets into which to sell. So I'm trying to come back. So the point Joe made
I want to pick up an AI.
Sorry, but just on that point that Joe made about the stock market, we used to have the major Irish companies that we think of now. Ryanair came to the stock market in 1997. Flutter, which was then Paddy Power, came at the same time. Kingspan came to the Irish stock market in the early to mid 1990s with a valuation of £50 million. Was that pounds before euros? It has grown to be an €8 billion business. These are major Irish multinationals who at times when they needed money were able to go to the stock market to do so. And that doesn't happen now anymore. And what happens instead is a lot of the new Irish companies, with some exceptions, sell out. They sell to private equity, or they take their money at an earlier stage. So we are not going to have as many of the major Irish multinationals in the future if we don't find a way to persuade invest in Ireland.
So coming back to your OpenAI lady, so Accenture were the anchor sponsor of all this, and they had an awful lot of speakers, and
this is at the event,
the Kerry event, in Global Economic Summit. And so they have actually put a lot of eggs in the AI basket. They have a studio in Dublin and all this kind of thing. They're global people there. So a few funnies, first of all. So I said to these people, they gave me a private explainer of how it could improve my life. So first of all, they said sub-editing is gone. You can take 1,000 words. They will write the headline. Not only that, if you need to do a few paragraphs of what did Matt Cooper do when he was editor of the Sunday Independent in the 60s or whatever it was. Do you understand me? You get fillers of data, you get court cases, and you have... So it's a deep research function, it's an edit function, so God help you in your job. Yeah.
I actually have now just remembered what was a really killer line from Sarah Fryer. And she said, we're talking about AI, the importance of asking the right question and asking a deep question. And it's funny, one thing that's really struck me now in using these things just over the last week, I'm sort of reluctantly taking them up because, you know, I don't believe that you should be cheating as such. But you can now ask, I suppose, an interpretive question. Mm-hmm. So, like, instead of asking for the CV of Ivan Yates, you can actually ask, how good or bad a minister was Ivan Yates in the Department of Agriculture? How was he regarded?
Well, you don't have to check AI for that. I can tell you, it's exemplary, one of the best ever.
That's actually probably not the answer I got of AI, would you believe?
Well, they probably weren't invented in the 90s, but carry on.
But they can go back. Not only do they go back, now does AI go back and give you an answer about your career and tell us about your political record. You can ask it like, what was the tenor of Ivan Yates's interaction with farmers or whatever? Mm-hmm. And it'll give you an interpreted answer. Now, you've got to make a decision as to whether you trust that or not, whether you trust it to be accurate. Because I've also found, I've just finished writing a new book, which will be out in September.
Which no doubt we'll hear a lot more of.
This is the first one of the gratuitous plugs. Yeah. But on a couple of occasions, I decided to try and test artificial intelligence in relation to bits of information. And a couple of times it couldn't find the stuff because the stuff hadn't appeared in print. And you got to remember that AI is working off all historical information, right? Mm-hmm. And if stuff hasn't been published, then it doesn't have anywhere to draw upon it from. But it also gave me wrong answers on occasions.
Yes.
And I was able to argue almost with the artificial intelligence, say, no, that's wrong. And then it comes back and apologises to you. And it's really bizarre that you're getting into this conversation with this inanimate
object. And was this verbally
object.
or in print?
I tend to... I don't. No, I'm not going to talk.
They
do
both.
They do both. I'm not getting into the conversation. So it's one thing sending text messages to an AI bot. It's another thing actually having a conversation with them.
So they had a whole section on ethics and so on. They said the big weakness of it. So first of all, I'll give you two funny lines. What is AI? Explain it to someone who's never heard television or used it. It's like teenage sex. It's talked a lot, but they don't do a lot of it. Do you understand me? And the second point was, it's only as good as the data that's fed into it. And so therefore, the trajectory, I was told, was in the next 2 years, as the data points get richer and deeper, that actually it will surpass humans and the regulatory issues. But the two big weaknesses, it can't do empathy. That, you know, the robot versus
the... neither can you.
Well, I can fake it. And they gave an example how there was this $80,000 car and AI, or whether it's Gemini, ChatGPT, or DeepSeek, and there was a real caution about DeepSeek. The Chinese get all the data that you put into it, even though it's 70% cheaper or whatever. But basically, it said you bought the car for $1. The howlers it made were such howlers that you'd nearly have to have human oversight of it. But obviously, the ethics of this and the regulation of it, they talked in detail about the distillation model and all of this.
Sorry, let me just give you an example, which I'm very interested in, and again, something I was at a couple of months ago where I really got, my interest was piqued by this. Just apply artificial intelligence use to health, right? All sorts of things. So, for example, now, something that came up yesterday, again, at the Real Deal conference, where we had representatives from Centric Health and Village Vets as two growing businesses. And Moss Cox from Centric Health was giving out about, we don't have, digitization of people's data and stuff. And okay, I know we're wondering.
In the US they do. And there's a big discussion on healthcare.
But just think of this logically, right? If, firstly, say you fall ill or if you're in an accident and you're brought into hospital, right? And they're trying to ask you questions as to what medication are you on? What prior conditions do you have? And you're not in a fit or conscious state to be able to provide that information. Can you imagine if, your phone is with you and they're able to get access to your health, which will say you have a bad back or you have this or you have all the rest of it, and they can immediately get to work on what might be wrong with you based on your data, and they know what medication and stuff you've taken. Inside in hospitals as well, everything been paper-based, looking for files, looking for charts, that if all your information is in a single digitized source about your medications, previous x-rays, MRIs, whatever and stuff, how much more effective and efficient your treatment could actually be.
There was a guy from Medtronic there, and he said the two advances with AI, they said they will be better than doctors at detecting cancer, because you'll have 50 data points about your bloods and all your records will be on your single electronic health record. So instead of someone visiting every 6 months for a checkup, they'll just be able to, AI will look at all these data points and say, your cancer could come back.
And I know people would say, oh, you'd be worried about hacking into your database and the rest of it, but we've seen plenty of examples of paper files been lost by the HSE or floppy disks been left in cars and stuff like that. And I say floppy disks advisedly because that's the level of the technology that the health service in Ireland is at. So you have an administration type thing. You also have diagnosis. Yes, there will be much, even if you put x-rays to an AI diagnostic, all sorts of things that can be done. Now, there is an ethical or moral consideration that you will have to sort of look at, because AI will actually allow in times, and DNA sequencing and the rest of it, if people are wealthy enough, they will be able to have full screening analysis done, which will probably predict what type of illnesses they'll get, which will predict when they will get them. And then there will be specially tailored medications for those who can afford it. This is where the issue is going to be affordability and access. And that's where there's going to be a lot of ethical considerations as to who gets the benefit out of artificial intelligence. But on an overall basis, if it is fairly applied, then it could be transformative for healthcare.
Another example that they gave was in the NHS. So say you're a rheumatologist or a specialist in and you're working in Bristol or Leeds or whatever, and say you go out sick for 2 days. and the total interruption, all the machines are idle and they can't get someone else, that they now have a centralised system. Okay, I can go down to London in 2 days' work, you know what I mean? And they have the same clinical skills. So the application of this in the health service, there was this guy who's 35 years CEO of Northwell in New York. It's the biggest single private sector health organisation. Employs 105,000 people. They have 20 hospitals. And what he spoke about was they have 1,050 clinics. So even a stent could be done in a clinic. You wouldn't have to go to hospital.
He's an Irish guy, isn't he?
He is. Michael, I have his name here.
I've heard of him.
Michael Dowling.
I've been told he's absolutely exceptional.
And you know what he said was really, that is worth repeating. He's retiring after 35 years. He said the advances that medicine and the health service has made over the last 30 years, because we later talk about children's health and hip operations and so on, which is a disaster and scandal, that basically he said you could not quantify the changes. We take them all for granted. But he also went into the fertility rate in the US being 1.6 of reproduce, and how what's going to happen, he said that 5% of the population are taking up 85% of the beds. It's people who, and there's 11,000 people, pensioners, every month or whatever it is, every week in his jurisdiction. And he said their chronic care requirements are going to put such a burden that unless the health service is reorganised, this is inevitable, the extra care required.
So that's in the US, is it?
Yes, yeah.
Here in Ireland, our ageing population and people living much longer, I think that's an underappreciated crisis. What's going to happen here in Ireland in hospitals and what's going to happen in nursing homes and all the rest of it. And also, I think he just emphasises as well, and we will be talking about our lack of infrastructure, all sorts of things. It's going to very much apply. We're going to be needing an awful lot more hospitals and hospital beds. Look, we have been talking for
and
so long.
And just after the break, can I say the other thing, which I needed an education on, Mick Mulvaney, who was Chief of Staff to Trump, was interviewed. Martin O'Malley, the former Cabinet Secretary.
I've interviewed both of them in the past.
And Richard Neal, a congressman who is seen as the leading Irishman. He's a ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee. Their insights into the current state of American politics and some of the personalities and the way Trump operates inside the room was fascinating. So we'll talk about that later. Okay,
we'll get to all of that when we come back after the break.
This episode of Path to Power is brought to you by Greenman, an Irish investment management firm. Greenman Open focuses on investing in grocery-anchored retail real estate, designed to generate stable, long-term income. The fund is managed in Ireland. Learn more on the website greenmanopen.com.
Now, before making any investment, it's important to understand the risks. Investments could go up or down, and past performance is not a reliable guide to future results. Greenman Open is a regulated LTIF, but like all investments, it carries risks. You should always seek advice from a financial professional before investing. Welcome back to Path to Power. Let's continue a little bit talking about where we've been during the week. And you, just before the break there, Ivan, mentioned 3 significant Irish Americans who were down in Killarney during the week. Martin O'Malley strikes me as a very interesting guy. I did an event with him as well a couple of years ago, and I did a podcast with him. Spent an hour chatting to him and then had a couple of pints with him afterwards, and found him a really, really interesting character because he's former governor of Maryland and from Baltimore. And he bridles a little bit of the suggestion that in The Wire that the character of the mayor was modelled on him. And he's had a bit of a row with David Simon, the creator of The Wire, over that. In fact, he had a real go at him when I interviewed him on the podcast about that. He was a guy who did make a run for the Democratic nomination for the presidency in 2015, but got knocked out pretty quickly when in the move to, effectively, it was all set up for Hillary Clinton. Bernie Sanders obviously did put it up to her at the time, but Martin O'Malley dropped out pretty quickly. And you sort of wonder if he's the type of guy who the sort of Democrats might sort of actually he might have a major role to play in trying to save the Democratic Party from the dreadful position it finds itself in now, because he's a sort of an ordinary guy in many respects. He sings in a band and stuff like that, you know. He's got a charisma about him.
He does. And it was quite funny because when Miriam O'Callaghan did the interview at Mick Mulvaney, I was actually standing near the door. And he as much as say, I can't listen to this shit. He didn't say that. He actually left. He said, I just can't stomach this.
Mulvaney's a strange one, isn't he?
He is. But no, Richard Neal, I found one of the most, because I was talking to him later in the evening. So he's a kind of Clinton-esque era, 30 years member of Congress from Massachusetts, has seen them all come and go, very respected. One of the leading, you know, after Tip O'Neill and that, he would be regarded back in the Priest process as one of the key pivotal guys behind the scenes. And as you become a ranking member of the Congress, he's the Ways and Means Committee. Actually, so he actually went through.
It's a bit like the Public Accounts Committee in Ireland.
Yeah, but it also covers trade and so on.
Yeah.
So he went through all the iterations of protectionism and free trade that he had negotiated, because, as we hear this morning in the court case from the International Trade Court in New York, that this was actually a matter for Congress trade. And it is a significant development.
This is a part of the attempted dictatorship of Donald Trump, that he decides everything by way of executive orders and just decide. And I think he had been relying on a provision almost like a wartime provision to justify doing this. But yeah, this is something that has to go through Congress. It is so significant what Trump is doing. But I'll get back to that.
Yeah, but that overreach and the consequences of, will it go to Supreme Court? Will it go to the Congress? How will Trump respond? Because this is such a central tenet of his whole trade protectionism and the leverage, and what happens to the negotiations, what happens is there refunds or whatever. But the most interesting guy, and he actually did an interview with Primetime for Miriam as well. So Mick Mulvaney was chief of staff for Trump right up, and then quit on the 6th of January 2020, the day of the trouble in Capitol Hill. So anyway, he said, what is the job of the chief of staff? And like, he's a real sort of tough guy. And he says, my job was to tell the president the really bad news that no one else will tell them. And he said there was days he went in and he said he sleeps 4 hours, he sleeps from 2 till 6, he reads every newspaper, looks at everything, and he rocks up to the office at 11. And then
that's when Trump is getting up, isn't it?
No, he gets up at 6.
Yeah, no, Mulvaney gets at 6.
No, this is Trump. Oh, he said he's a complete workaholic. And he said that
he's watching television all the time.
Well, no, he's doing that too, but like, put it like, he only does 4 hours sleep. This is what the guy said. I wasn't there, but I'm just telling you. He said that he had to give him, like, there was, say, maybe court cases on deportations that hadn't gone the right way, and basically he would have to deal with his tantrums, we'll say. Now, he defended him, but he parted ways with the 6th of January issue.
Which is why I actually have an issue with Mulvaney, and I interviewed him recently.
Yeah.
So,
he's a friend of Ireland.
Yeah, he is, and stuff. And he also, though, believes that Ireland should almost be sort of taking America's side over the EU and this sort of stuff. I think there's this attitude, I think, to an extent within the Trump administration, they'd almost like to break us away from the EU. They'd sort of look, Trump apparently, and it was Mulvaney gave me this line actually, Trump sort of looks at Ireland a little bit differently, possibly because we speak English and also because he owns a golf course here, and he has a liking for the Irish because of that, and probably can't understand why we're so entrenched as part of the European Union.
And I have to say that the audience, I'd say, didn't resonate with him the way they resonated with O'Malley and Neil, to be fair, okay?
Is that because of our biases in Ireland?
Oh, of course. But anyway.
But sorry, the thing with Mulvaney is that he knows that what Trump did on the 6th of January was so wrong that it should have been disqualifying for him to ever be president again. And yet Mulvaney still defends Trump and defends what he's doing now. Okay, maybe cautiously, maybe he doesn't seem enthusiastic.
He's not part of the administration anymore.
He's not, and he's not enthusiastic. But I wonder, are they all too shit scared to actually speak up against what Trump is doing?
There was two, I always, instead of cursing the dark, trying to find something I didn't know before, there was two things he explained to me from their perspective, the Republican thing. why would someone vote for Trump? Why did the whole establishment get rejected and they go for this kind of extreme option? He said the feeling in America for a lot of people is they vote for change, be it right, left or centre, and they don't get change. And they're disillusioned with politics, and then they go to someone extreme like Trump, who has sort of drained the swamp and flood the zone and all this. The second thing that I thought was interesting was he described the deep state. And the way he described it was, he described some regulatory quango that was set up in the Obama thing. And he said that he had run this at a particular point in time. And it employs 1,100 people. And he said they did a review of it, and under Doge or whatever, they got rid of 250. He said the number of people required to run this is 7. And he said the amount of layers and the disillusionment with Washington, bureaucracy and so on, that it's gone out of control is a real thing. Now, so I'm just saying what he said. I don't know enough about American politics, but put it like this. I found his action, like he said, that one of the things that Trump did, almost sort of like a Roman emperor was, he would get 2 people in the room, one for free trade, one for, and he would let them go at it hammer and tongs, so that he could kind of hear the plaintiff and the defendant and make up his mind like a jury on things. And that was it was a kind of conflict management style, which as chief of staff was very difficult.
Okay, but you notice it's been another week of Trump. After we recorded last Friday, Trump announced suddenly, I don't know whether after you say it's only 4 hours sleep, but whether he got up in a bad mood or whatever, got out of the bed the wrong side, he suddenly announced 50% tariffs on everything coming from the European Union.
It was a Truth Social tweet.
Post or whatever. On his own money-making machine. And suddenly markets fall sharply. And then over the weekend, he has a phone conversation with Ursula von der Leyen. Very nice conversation, very good. So there's a delay of 6 weeks put on this while they try and sort things up, and the markets go up again. And, there's been so many market gyrations over the last few months based on Trump's pronouncements, and you got to sort of wonder who's profiting from all of that, who's buying, who's selling. I was just listening to one example on another podcast of the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, selling a load of stock on the same day as a Trump announcement, which sent the stock market down. I don't know whether she was in just before or reacted just afterwards, but there are enormous suspicions as to what's going on in relation to the stock market movements and whether he ever intends the pronouncements he makes to stick, or whether it's just to get attention.
Well, I think the market is now greatly discounting his posts insofar as what I heard, because after last week's podcast, I spoke to someone who had worked in the EU Commission and now has a day job of keeping in touch with Capital L. And basically, he said that framework deals are being done with India on pharma and other areas. Now, whether this court case throws all that into flux, but he said some people, the actual detail of the deal will take a year to negotiate, but that these framework deals, but that really the people in it, and I was told what really pissed him off about Europe that led to this particular 50% tariff was, and I don't know the full detail of it, there was some connection between Europe and China, that his real target is China, and he wanted Europe's cooperation. And apparently Europe sells huge number of German cars to China or whatever, and that basically Europe were not going to give America the dig out. They wanted to put more leverage on China, and that this was a retaliation of that. Now, look, it is a pinball stuff. It doesn't make any sense. But I do think, because I'm opposed to the tariffs, that the court case is actually a get-out-of-jail card for the rest of the world, because yesterday I was at this manufacturing thing and it was a supply chain, and all these consultants
sounds like fun.
Well, all these consultants who do logistics, you know what I mean? And they do duty systems and all this kind of thing, and technical barriers and so on, as well as financial barriers, and that would be for pharma and everything. The level of uncertainty in all of this has actually got to a point that you wonder, is it all a bottle of smoke at the end of the day?
Well, I'll tell you what the uncertainties are. 2 points I want to make here. One is that I know from talking to a lot of people in business that their problem is that they now are really can't do many of the things they want to do.
Well, on the investment side.
Or, they're having to cut costs on things. This is having an employment effect. And we say that despite the fact there's been 90,000 additional people working in Ireland from a year ago, as we mentioned last week. But, going into the future, there's an enormous amount of uncertainty, and this is bad for people for hiring and making investments, or for people moving jobs and the rest of it. But the other thing in relation to Trump, and I know, you don't throw at me the Trump derangement syndrome, blah, 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 and all this sort of stuff. But, he's into this distraction stuff, and, it's whack-a-mole type stuff. He does one thing here, he does another thing there. Whereas then the big grifts, like his latest cryptocurrency scam for the family, almost gets missed in the midst of all of this. Backed up by, and it's deeply suspicious, J.D. Vance going to a cryptocurrency convention in Vegas at the Venetian Hotel in recent days, talking up cryptocurrency has been so important. And this is Vance on behalf of the Peter Thiels and all the rest of the world who want cryptocurrencies as an alternative to state-regulated financial systems and the rest of it. The stuff that is going on at the moment is almost dystopian. It is quite extraordinary.
Well, I think the court case gives a glimmer of hope. Let it go to the Supreme Court, but it actually puts the handbrake on a lot of this stuff and means that some of the leverage he thought he had, he doesn't have in the negotiations, particularly with Europe. One other thing from the GES, the Global Economic Summit, was there was a discussion, and I am not, Rory Stewart, I would say, is a world expert on global security, and you ask me, do I listen to podcasts? I sometimes listen to him. But basically, on this panel, Mark Mellett, who we hope to have on this podcast in the summer.
Well, sorry, just to say that what we're going to do over the summer is mainly as well it'll be on the subscription service on the Path to Power Plus. Is going to be, we will do a series of interviews not with politicians, but with people with an involvement in the political process, just to give some value over the quieter summer months to our subscribers. Sorry.
So Mark Mellett is a former Chief of Defence, tells a story how he brought Leo as Taoiseach out on some naval boat and said, look, you've got to do a commission into the Irish defence strategy, blah, blah, blah. It ended up as a commission for the Defence Forces, more pay and conditions for that. But he went through the China South Sea, the Taiwan Chinese situation. He went through North Korea. He went through Iran. He went through Africa. He went through the Sudan and Somalia. In space of 10 minutes, he went through then Putin and Europe, and then he went right through the domestic challenges to Ireland with their interconnectors, with their cables, and exactly how much interest the Russian Federation is showing in these, the surveillance they've done on it, and the likely threats. He talked about cybersecurity. But the point about it is, rarely have I heard through Irish eyes. You listen to lots of American security people and European security people, but he actually did it all through Irish eyes. Now, his central point was that we're freeloading and that can't continue. But he said, and this was a really interesting point, the likes of Putin relies on the rest of Europe's apathy and passivity to get away with stuff. And they actually factor and bake it in that we will say, sure, what about it? And so therefore, I really am interested in getting him on the podcast in July or whatever. And he works a lot. He's a consultant now and works abroad and so on. But put it like this, he's able to concisely summarise, and then he talks about the bot campaigns and all the rest of it, how they're interfering with elections and so on, who's manipulating them, the HSE cyber attack and the politics of that and so on. It is fascinating. Now, I'm not a spook myself, but he nearly talked into being a spook.
Okay. One last thing. My God, I can't believe we've got this far. You've been in Killarney, I've been in Kildare. So let's come back to Dublin. What do you think was the most important thing that happened in Leinster House on Wednesday?
Do you have something in mind?
Well, I tell you what got all the attention.
Was the 3-year extension on the planning thing is obviously the thing that's caught my eye, because it was actually a lose-lose scenario. If you were subject to a judicial review, even if you won it, your 5-year planning ran out of time. So they have introduced a 3-year extension so that the planning will actually stop the clock for the period of the judicial review. And also, it's not a land hoarding measure because you won't get the benefit of it unless you activate within 6 months or whatever. This was originally provided for in the Planning Act, but isn't specifically, there's secondary legislation required. fair play to James Brown. And I heard only this morning he made a speech at Property Industry Ireland where he announced a number of measures which would be game changers. So let's see.
Yeah, that was Tuesday's thing. I was actually asking you about Wednesday and what happened in there. So there was Oireachtas committee meetings on Wednesday and all of the attention was placed on RTE. And that, to my mind, was not the most significant Oireachtas meeting that took place on Wednesday. The most significant one by a country mile, which is far more relevant to the lives of everyone in the country, was in relation to what Uisce Éireann went in and told the Infrastructure Committee. Because we are now seeing more and more information coming out about the crisis. There's a report on Thursday morning, front page of the Irish Daily Mail, that we could have water rationing in Dublin within 5 years. Because quite simply, we know that when it comes to the building of new houses and apartments, we have major issue with getting planning permissions because Uisce Éireann cannot assure the water supply. So many of the businesses that we require to develop in Ireland, which create the corporation tax revenues to pay for things, are dependent on water supply. Separately to that, there's an Irish Independent report about the crisis in relation to the electricity supply and again, the import of the grid. For all of the talk that we have about what happened in RT, and I'm not saying that, it's unimportant. And, I look at the idea of RT spending €96,000 on an ad promoting its newsroom. And we've had all the row this week about that as to, whether they were employing extras. And the very idea that an institution, a media company, which is so far in debt, which needs so much subsidy, will be spending any money on using outside people to make an ad, right? That could, if you just gave one person and told them, make something for us based on all of the material that has appeared in RT television newsroom over the last year, put that together, it wouldn't have cost a couple of grand to actually do, I think, if you were to do it. And there's other things I could bring up in relation to that. But anyway, whatever it is about RT, and I'm falling into the trap now of talking about RT, the most important thing that actually needs to be discussed in a lot more detail and needs action upon is what's happening with our basic infrastructural needs with water and electricity.
Two things about that. One is, I've been banging on relentlessly about it. If you spend any time, Niall Gleeson, Maria O'Dwyer's head of asset delivery in Irish Water, Orla Blaney, who's in charge of their public affairs, you will get that this is absolutely critical. And in fairness, Matt, for 3 years it's been critical. And, and
we've been banging on about it on this podcast for a year
GDD,
as well.
the Greater Dublin Drainage Scheme, is still, and I have to call out Bord Planola here, they're still engaged in, they can't get a decision one way or the other. So the High Court said, you're the liaison between the EPA and the Bord Planola wasn't good enough, and it's been stuck in that for years, and we'll pay price. But even worse than that, I actually think it's possible that Irish Water have understated. A friend of mine had a runner at the Curragh, and I was sitting beside on Saturday at the 2000 Guineas, Jed Pearce, the man who built more of Ireland's infrastructure in the 70s and 80s and 90s than anyone else. Pearce,
Jed, who's McInerney's first, and then he set up Pearce after
Pearce
that.
Engineer. Yeah. And he went through Ringsend and all the different things he'd been involved. He said, Ivan, mark my words. He said, no one asks an engineer's opinion. He said, within 6 years, there will be 12 hours per day water rationing in Dublin. And I said, that couldn't be right. And he said, mark my words. So, I mean, that's absolutely...
And then everyone will be jumping up and down and screaming,
and blaming Irish Water.
How do we let this happen and all the rest of it and stuff? And you know what's also, there's going to have to be a bit of political balls shown as well, right? When it comes to diverting water from the Shannon. And I think the two major things, as you say, look, yes, we need to do particularly in Dublin, we need to replace an awful lot of the existing pipes because of the incredible amount of leakage and all the rest of it is. And that needs to be done. But then look at all the whinging you'll get from people with the traffic disruption that's going to be caused and all the rest of it. But that has to be done. What also has to be done is that wastewater facility.
Well, the Wayleaf CPOs have to be done as well.
Has to be done, right? But then water from the Shannon. And there will be a small, highly vocal lobby who will actually jump up and down and say...
And go to the High Court, yeah.
And they say, this is our local resource. It's a national resource. The Shannon, the water of it, belongs to everybody in the country. And if we're having more rainfall and the rest of it, and we're having flooding in the Shannon, then surely diverting 3% of its volume each year for the use of people outside the immediate catchment area is in the national interest. So just get on with it.
On the electricity side, can I actually say something positive? Barry Heenahan, who is a qualified engineer with a degree, asked his lecturer just before he was elected, what is the most important thing to resolve electricity crisis? And he said, legislation that would enable private wires. And he actually sent me a video of 3 minutes where he was talking about this. And basically what he was saying, if you had a block of 300 apartments, right? You have to get 6 separate ESB connections to it for the lift, for the different blocks and so on. And actually that there could be actually 310 individual meters and wires and so on. He said that actually if you introduce private wires, the developer could actually get his own generator or a generator, but also create a microgrid. Like, part of the situation throughout the continent is they have said no to the state monopoly of Airgrid and to ESB networks and said, look, if you do a new development, we'll take Ballyboggin, and the developers want to introduce electricity, they would have private wires. The law needs to be changed. Now, he's produced a private member's bill on this, but look, I've got to the stage with this government, there's 2 things. Urgency to replace complacency. Sounds like a bit of a thing, but I actually am detecting complacency. And the other thing is, just don't tell me, Darragh O'Brien, about what you're doing. Show me what you're doing.
You say complacency. Maybe it's capability. I mean, is that not major issue? Is that these people they know what the problems are. They've been told what the problems are.
But Darragh has told Barry we're going to do this. Why don't you do it? Like 10 years ago, they're like, where's the CRU, the Commission for Regulation of Utilities? This is a simple, quick fix. It actually involves private sector money. It just makes people just go and do it. And these microgrids are a real solution. And so therefore we've moved to a different era. And I'm just sick of, it's going to take another 6 months and the legislation and all this. Just goddamn do it.
Well, one last thing, because you've mentioned Barry Heenahan, and he's in the news on Wednesday night because he's part of the independent group, which Michael Lowry, their de facto leader at the time of negotiation, said would support the government in good times and in bad times. And what does Barry Heenahan and Gillian Toole do in the Dáil on Wednesday night? They voted against the coalition in favour of the Sinn Féin bill in support of Palestine. This is about the bonds at the central bank overseas, which are painted by the opposition as Israeli war bonds. I suppose there's nothing the government can do to Barry Heenahan or Gillian Toole, is there?
And not only...
and maybe they shouldn't as well. I think on an issue like this, there should be perhaps freedom of conscience should come into it.
Well, put it like this. I met him for a cup of coffee in the Alex Hotel back in February, and he's a new guy, right? And I thought he was a bit wet behind the ears, to be honest, and naive about some of this. And he actually said to me, he said, I don't feel obligated on every issue. Okay, for the budget and big things, I'm not going to be trooping in on every issue. So I wasn't a bit surprised about that. I thought it was naive a little bit because I know Mary Butler will have a conniption over this as the government chief whip and say, well, you're either a part of us or you're not. But that's their problem. What I'm trying to say is, please, Darragh, would you, Darragh O'Brien I'm talking about, would you just do things? You've left a legacy in housing where the one thing everyone agrees about was that there was an element of smoke and mirrors about housing for all.
That's
the
generous.
Way it ended up. What do you want to add?
Well, sorry, if you look at, this is the man, 40,000 output last year, kept getting people in the government to say it. We all knew it wasn't going to be true. And then, oh God, it only turned out to be 30,000 after all.
Are you saying he was deliberately disingenuous, or what are you saying? Well, because not like it to make it provocative.
If he wasn't being deliberately disingenuous, he was being completely not on top of his brief and not good enough to hold the job.
Now, there's 2 things we haven't done in this episode. One, the aviation thing, and the second is the whole Children's Hospital Ireland.
Yeah, and there's lots of other things we need to get to as well. We'll do that in the additional episode, which is available to subscribers. You can find that wherever it is you get your podcasts. pat2powerpodcast.com is the address, and you can also mail us there as well. We're not going to be doing your questions in this edition, but there are loads in which I'm putting together for a bumper episode next week, which may be a quieter week next week
and
after the bank holiday.
Also in the extra episode, the EPA figures of the scores on the doors. We're not even going to get halfway on our glorious emissions targets.
Just like our housing targets as well, when you see what was said by, I think it was by the Central Bank and by the ESRI and others this week. Anyway, we'll get to all of that. That's it for this edition. From me, Matt Cooper.
From me, Ivan Yates.
Thank you very much for being with us.